The mission of ICJS is to dismantle religious bias and bigotry by building learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. And we're delighted to have you here today for our webinar conversation. So a brief introduction and a history of Dabru Emet on one foot, as it were. In the late 1990s, then ICJS, then the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies, hosted the National Jewish Scholars Project. After several years of meeting in Baltimore, 4 interdenominational Jewish scholars, Tikva Frymer-Kensky, David Novak, Peter Oakes, and Michael Signer, published Dabru Emet, translated as Speak Truth, as a full-page statement in the New York Times, the Baltimore Sun, and other major newspapers and religious websites on September 10th, 2000. Consisting of 8 claims, Dabru Emet is a Jewish statement on Christianity. The statement was signed by more than 170 rabbis and Jewish intellectuals. Signers grew to more than 220 over the following months and years. The Dabru Emet generated both praise and criticism with its publication. As an organization devoted to inquiry around religion and religious difference, ICJS welcomed robust debate around Dabru Emet when it was published in 2000. In that same spirit, ICJS, in partnership with American Religion, invited scholars and thinkers to revisit Dabru Emet in a public-facing online academic forum in honor of the statement's 20th anniversary. The contributors who join me today with other scholars from around the world and across disciplines, many of whom are also joining us in the audience today, are engaging in critique as well as commemoration, historical reflection and reframings, rigorous inquiry, and creative imaginings for what's next. So when we were pulling the series together, I just want to sort of reflect a little bit about how we approach this essay series. We wanted participants and contributors to sort of look back and really think about whether Dabru Emet can speak to this present moment and consider how the world has changed in 20 years. We also invited people to sort of look ahead and again, engage in those creative imaginings for what's next. We wanted to map the terrain of Jewish-Christian relations and also to think about Jewish-Christian relations within the larger field of interreligious studies and dialogue. Can we identify the issues and the ideas that will define dialogue in the next 20 years? 32 different contributors mused on these matters, and we are all the better for it. I am just so delighted to have 5 of those contributors here today. And for the sake of sort of a webinar introduction, I'm going to invite each panelist to introduce themselves by sharing their name, their position, and their institution, and then answer the following question to get us started. I'm going to ask each of the contributors why the topic of Jewish-Christian relations is important to them, and what role does Jewish-Christian dialogue or interreligious dialogue play in their research, institutions, life, and work. And I'm going to invite Halla to go first.
Hello. I'd like to begin by thanking Heather and everybody at ICJS for putting together this wonderful event. And it's just been such an honor and a pleasure to participate in the series on Dabru Emet. So my name is Halla Attallah, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Georgetown University at the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. There I do work on the Quran, the Quran's discourse, and the stories of the Quran. So these are the stories of the former figures and prophets, most of whom are also found in the biblical traditions. I also do a fair amount of work on the Hebrew Bible. And my entry point into my research is through literary gender and disability studies. So I'm really interested in how the Quran not only engages in storytelling, but how this storytelling represents different groups of people. I should say that I don't work directly in interfaith dialogue. However, this question of interfaith learning, this component and sensibility is definitely there in my work on a number of levels. So on the textual level, the Quran engages regularly and directly with the other monotheistic traditions, Judaism and Christianity in particular. So the Quran, for example, will reference the Torah and the Gospels. And as I mentioned, many of the stories that the Quran alludes to are from the biblical traditions. So there is this interfaith dimension that's kind of already built in to my source text that I do work on. On a more meta or academic level, many of the scholars who do examine the stories of the Quran do examine it through an interfaith lens via the biblical traditions. So there is an interfaith element there, and this awareness helps me engage with my academic interlocutors better. And finally, I consider interfaith questions and awareness like questions of related to race, gender, and disability. These are all social justice issues. So being aware of stereotypes or rhetoric pertaining to the religious other is something that is really crucial to my work.
So my name is Mary Boyes, and I also am especially pleased to be part of this panel with my fellow distinguished panelists, and to be a part of the work of the ICJS, which has been so impressive, and I think all the more so during the pandemic. For the last 27 years, I've been teaching at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, which is positioned across the street from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and that's one of the reasons I decided to move to New York to accept the position. I'm the Skinner and McAlpin Professor of Practical Theology. I have been interested in the question of Jewish-Christian relations for a very long time, and for reasons that are not entirely clear even to me. When I noted the question we were asked, you know, why is it important to you? I started to get very interested in this topic when I was in high school. And I think it would be the spring of 1965 that I helped to organize a dialogue day with a youth group from the synagogue that was about 2 miles from my high school. I haven't pursued this single-mindedly over the years, but I have become more and more convinced of, I guess I've simply to say my passion lies very much in helping Christians to rethink our self-understanding in light of the now ever-growing body of scholarship on relations between Jews and Christians over the centuries. So much of our self-understanding as Christians, and I speak from within the Roman Catholic tradition, has been premised on a negative mirror image with Judaism. Judaism has been the other with whom we defined ourselves as the true way. And that claim is no longer in any way theologically responsible or in any way accurate to the complexity of the situations. And so I am happy to engage in this massive re-education project for Christians. And along the way, I am deeply, deeply indebted to my Jewish friends for so many understandings about Jewish life.
It's a pleasure to be with everybody. And if you ask where my interest in interfaith began, I would have to say it began in my childhood because my father was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And interfaith work with Christians was central when I was growing up in our home and our dinner table from my father, very important. I have to say also that I fell in love with the Bible thanks both to my father and to Martin Luther King. My father was involved in the civil rights movement. And when I went to college, I was still in love with the Bible and thought that I would go on to graduate school in biblical studies, Hebrew Bible. But then I discovered that the Bible is one thing, but the scholarship on the Bible is something very different. And I felt that scholars of the Bible were not asking the right questions, that they had very little sense of the poetry of the Bible and the ability of the Bible to speak to our hearts and to change and soften our hearts, as Dr. King did, invoking the prophets. So instead, I decided to study the history of biblical scholarship and the pathology of biblical scholarship. My first book was a study of a 19th century German Jewish historian named Abraham Geiger, whose first book was about the Quran, demonstrating that the way that the Quran retells certain biblical stories was actually taken from midrashic texts, from rabbinic commentaries. And he wrote also extensively about early Judaism and early Christianity and the figure of Jesus as a Jew. And then in my next book, I looked at the Christian responses, namely the turn by German Protestant theologians at the end of the 19th century to racial theory and to the argument that Jesus was an Aryan and not a Jew. And this was based on archives that I discovered in the former East Germany of an anti-Semitic propaganda institute that sought to de-Judaize Christianity in the Nazi period. And then my next book was a study of the history of Jewish scholarship on Islam, on the Quran, beginning with Geiger in his book from 1833 and continuing until the Nazi period, mostly in Germany, but also more broadly in Europe. I would just finally say that I'm especially interested in the meaning of the prophets, not only for biblical scholars, but also in the civil rights movement and in Black intellectual thought. At the moment, I'm writing an article about Cornel West, for example. And that's where I find very important affinities between Judaism, and especially my father's work on the prophets, and Christianity, that is, among Black theologians. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I echo everyone else. It is really an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you today and to be a part of this conversation. I came to some of this. I studied Jewish and Christian theology in graduate school and sort of left theological studies because I became interested in questions about gender and identity and using kind of feminist and critical theory to do that. And then my work really, I started teaching Holocaust when I was a graduate student at Emory. And that got me really thinking about issues of representation and kind of literary critical approaches. And when I got to Temple, which is a very important site of interreligious critical engagement, I kind of came at the tail end of a very long history. But what that project did was it brought me some of my very first graduate students who came from Germany, who were exchange students at Temple. And so I've had the privilege of working with extraordinary thinkers in the early parts of their career, people like Tanya Oldenhaga, my first doctoral student, who wrote about parable scholarship, Christian parable scholarship post-Holocaust. And in the process of doing that, I started to write about Holocaust commemoration and Holocaust memory. And I was really interested, and I am interested in how different losses touch each other and the ways in which we think about our implications in each other's histories and in our ongoing engagement. And because Temple's program in religion, which I've been at Temple since the early 90s, the program is really a comparative program, and many of our students come from across the globe. And so I've learned a great deal from working with a very diverse student body. And my job has been often to teach Judaism to people who are not going to be working on Judaism. And they're both Christian and Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim. And I think that, you know, this work is just really powerful and important. And although I don't do dialogue the ways in which some of my colleagues have done it, the work across difference has just been an abiding part of the work I do. And I would say in my last book, thinking about material objects of violence and how they are holy, have been very much informed, as it turns out, by work by scholars who work on the interrelationship between Judaism and Christianity, and by particularly Catholic scholars writing about relics and reliquary. So these are some of the things that I bring to this conversation.
My name is Malka Simkovich. I'm the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and the Director of the Catholic Jewish Studies program at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Before I go any further, I want to say a big thank you to the organizers of this conference, Heather Miller-Rubens, Ben Sachs, Karen Keller, and I'm so happy to be with my fellow panelists today. And I also want to note that some of our attendees today are people who have really changed the face of Jewish-Christian relations in a very profound and foundational way, including my predecessors at CTU, Rabbi Dr. David Sandmill and Father John Polakowski. So it's very wonderful to see them at this event today. So I fell into Jewish-Christian relations and dialogue without any training whatsoever. I was trained at Brandeis in early Judaism and early Christianity, and my work on universalist ideas in early Judaism, and particularly my first book, my dissertation, which argued that Paul was not borrowing universalist ideas from the Stoics, but actually from Greek-speaking Jews. Apparently, to my shock, this was interesting to some Christian theologians. But the truth is, I really was very naive that my work would be interesting to anybody, because when you're writing on something for so many years, you hope that maybe 5 people will read it when you're done. But I landed at CTU in a very serendipitous way. And the truth is, it's always been a learning curve. I've been there since 2014. But as an Orthodox Jew, it never really occurred to me that Christians would contend with Judaism on a personal and on a theological level, because I, as an Orthodox Jew, really never contended with Christianity on a personal or theological level. And so part of my learning curve at CTU was realizing that Christians, many of them of deep faith, have thought very carefully about their relationship with Jews and Judaism. And the truth is that Dabru Emet is very, very significant, because what it did 20 years ago is I think that it helped to mainstream talking about Christianity and a relationship with Christianity and Christians from the Jewish end. So this was the first, but not the last, the first of a few very significant statements coming from the Jewish community. And this is a new phenomenon. So I think we're right now at a turning point in Jewish-Christian dialogue. And it's a turning point that's very personal for me as an Orthodox woman, which is, are we going to continue to engage in dialogue? By we, I mean Jews, but maybe specifically Orthodox Jews. Are we going to continue to engage in dialogue just on the premise that we don't want people to hate us? Or maybe there's a possibility for religious transformation in a very positive way. And I think this is a question that people are starting to ask. It doesn't have a simple answer. I'm very personally invested in the question. And I think that Dabru Emet really paved the way to ask the question, maybe not to provide us with the answers, but definitely to help us articulate this question. So thank you very much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Building off of actually, Malka, where you kind of left off, I want us to think about the historical context question and sort of the year 2000 and the year 2021. So how has the context of Jewish-Christian relations, interreligious relations, changed over the last 2 decades? What are some of the important developments and differences that impact interreligious encounter? And I invite Malka to go first. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. It's a great question. And, like I just said a minute ago, regarding other conversations, there are more questions than answers, I think, here. But Dabru Emet, like I said, was the first, as far as I know, the first really sort of Jewish, multi-denominational response to decades of Christian overtures, particularly from the Catholic Church, that it's, I wouldn't say met with silence. Certainly there were backdoor conversations and dialogue groups, but nothing that was as public facing as Dabru Emet. And I think that what we've seen in the past 2 decades, especially with the rise of social media and this sort of democratization of these conversations that were happening in the ivory tower or in these sort of elite spaces, is that now there is a mainstreaming of dialogue that is entering the public sphere. And so we're having this trickle down, I think, whereas dialogue was happening between Jews and Christians, certainly well before 2000. I mean, we know Susannah just mentioned her father, who was pivotal in this conversation. That was in the 60s. So of course there were Jews who were involved in helping shape Nostra Aetate and helping shape dialogue for many decades. But I think that what happened in 2000 with Dabru Emet is that we began to see a new stage of dialogue, which engages lay people and engages people through their screen very often. I do want to mention 2 other documents that were recently published that are specific, I think, to the Jewish-Catholic relationship. And that is the 2015 document To Do the Will of Our Father in Heaven and the 2017 document Between Jerusalem and Rome. These are primarily spearheaded by Orthodox Jewish leaders. So therefore, again, maybe not representative of the Jewish perspective, nothing is. But what's interesting about these documents is that they do something that Dabru Emet doesn't, which is that there's a comfort level, I think, with the friendship that has already been established. And I think because of the comfort level, there are differences, and not just differences addressed between Jews and Christians, but also tensions. And so if you look at Dabru Emet, and some of you have noted that you have a legitimate problem with this, it sort of glosses over very profound and difficult tensions between our communities. But these more recent documents are saying, okay, we need to talk about this, right? We need to talk about what is the Christian legacy of the Holocaust. Not that we're going to all reach a consensus or agree, but this is a conversation that we are now comfortable having. And so naming the differences and naming the tensions, that I think is very recent. I think it's very positive. And I think it's bringing us into a new stage of dialogue.
Thank you so much, Malka. Would anyone else want to weigh in on this question of history and context and looking back over the last 20 years?
I think that there was some sense among at least some of the writers of Dabru Emet that the other Christians groups, church traditions, so forth, had put out statements, but there was nothing coming from the Jewish community. Now, of course, many Christians had no understanding of the diversity of Jewish life, and so I think that there was, and some of the writers of Dabru Emet were deeply, deeply involved in Jewish-Christian relations. I should show my hand to say that the late Rabbi Michael Signer was a very good friend of mine. And I think he had such an intense commitment to Dabru Emet. And I only wish I had been in the room, because I think the statement, especially at the distance of 20 plus years, it needs a new edition for sure. But the fact that these four could work together and representing very diverse streams of Jewish thought. So this was sort of, and the fact that they made the decision to publish it in the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun. And I still remember opening my paper that day. So it was a way of saying, we want this to say, we want to be public about this. These four Jews, at least, want to keep a conversation going with Christians because we can trust the process. I think they think that's the message. We can trust the process of engagement.
So I'd like to perhaps say some critical things, let's say. I have the impression, and perhaps I'm wrong, but I have the impression that in the 1960s, during the discussions around Nostra Aetate before and after, that there were quite a few Jews involved from a range of affiliations. That is, secular, reform. My father was Orthodox, but he taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is conservative. I have a feeling today that there may be some more division, or let me put it this way. What concerns me sometimes is that liberal Jews talk to liberal Christians, conservative Jews, I mean with a small c, talk to conservative Christians. And sometimes even within our community, within the Jewish community, for example, I think of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of Great Britain, who was perfectly comfortable to sit down with the Dalai Lama, for instance, and with Christians, but was not comfortable coming to Reform rabbis and having a dialogue with feminist Jews or with the group that formed Limud, the Jewish educational group, and so on. So I worry about the internal dynamics, and I don't know if you've noticed anything similar within, well, we just saw in the newspaper, the Southern Baptists, or within the Catholic community. Do people who are more right-wing, left-wing, are they able to have a dialogue together as Catholics? That would be something worrying me. And then in terms of the audience, I would just say that my impression is Dabru Emet was very well received with enthusiasm, in fact, especially in Europe by Christian theologians, but perhaps even more so than by Jewish communities, whether in Europe or in Israel or in the US or elsewhere. I don't know how interested Jews have been in Dabru Emet. I haven't heard Jews talking about it. So I wonder about that question too.
Thank you, Susannah. I'm wondering if we could kind of build on a theme or a thread here on your answers around sort of authority and who is speaking, who gets to speak, and who are they speaking to? And to sort of reflect back on the position of the 4 original drafters and signatories of Dabru Emet and sort of where they were positioned, right? That they were in large universities and they were claiming a certain academic authority, and they were also not in Jewish institutions. They were employed in different university contexts. And so it kind of is this bigger question of who's permitted to do an authorized theology, who gets to speak theologically in interreligious contexts, and who's left out of those conversations. Maybe Susannah, do you want to go first?
Well, too often I see, for example, a photograph of a big interfaith meeting and they're all men. That's one thing. So today it's really lovely to finally be involved as a woman with other women to discuss this issue. But I also perhaps would point out one thing. Dabru Emet was very much written for a broad audience, even though it was written by people at universities. At the same time, I also think relationships are very important, personal relationships. Sometimes, in fact, really changed a whole field. So even as Dabru Emet was going along, we also have scholars who, through their personal relationships or simply through their investigations, have really changed the field, for example, of New Testament studies or of medieval relations between Christians and Jews. And that's another kind of interreligious or interfaith work that I think has been quite dramatic in the scope of the books and articles that have been published and the way in which we think today about how to present the origins of Christianity, for example, and also the origins of Islam in an interfaith setting. That's very different from the way it was 100 years ago.
Thank you, Susannah. Would anyone else want to weigh in on sort of the issues of authority or who gets to speak in interreligious contexts?
Well, speaking as a Catholic woman, Laura, I just saw your hand, so if you want to speak. So I'll be brief about this. So the bishops are the ones who have the authority to speak, and they certainly claim it. But I also think that there's an authority of knowledge, and that so I may have no official right to speak in my own church, but it seems to me that the scholarship that we produce as scholars has its own, carries its own authority. And what I think is really tragic right now in the Catholic context is that many bishops are not interested in this scholarship. And so when they go to make statements, they're often lacking nuance and depth, and very often, sometimes, accuracy. So I think there is certainly this tension, and of course there's also some gender issues, but I'll move off of that, and Laura, maybe that's where you want to pick up.
No, I just appreciate what both of you have already said, and I guess I would add to this a couple of things. First of all, I think that one of the things that's really changed is that university spaces, which created a kind of platform for many of the, certainly all of the signers of, and the people who developed Dabru Emet to begin with, those kinds of positions are not as stable now as they were then. And so there is a kind of precarity, so that, and in my piece I wrote about how Katharina von Kellenbach, who's been a very important thinker in this regard, her department, her program has been downsized. She was a tenured full professor at St. Mary's College in Maryland. And I think we have to just recognize the tenuousness of the kind of authority that did bolster the original signers. And some of us, but not all of us who are here, some are graduate students, some are working outside of university settings, or even, you know, and some seminary settings are more stable than others. So I want to kind of keep that kind of structural problem on the table. And then I think the question of gender and who gets to speak. And I think one of the signers who also contributed to this 20-year retrospective did write quite powerfully about the arguments around questions of authority. And I appreciate that he did that. But in the process of doing that, he ended up speaking in the name of the one woman, Tivka Fryer-Kinski, who is no longer with us as well, and kind of retold the story, her story. And I'm not sure whose voice that was, but I want to imagine, and I wish she were here to talk to us more fully in her own voice about what it was like to be the woman in that room making some of these arguments and really grappling with this. And I think that they were friends. The whole group were very close, and I appreciate those intimacies. But I also want to kind of highlight how different it is that this is a conversation now 20 years later with a range of scholars who are in various stages of our careers and we are all women, and that has not been always at the forefront of interreligious engagement, and certainly not when it comes to, as Mary pointed out, those who speak with authority. So my former student, Marian Ronan, has been very much active in Catholic feminist circles for a very long time. And I think that some of the ways in which we do interreligious is the ways in which we cross boundaries, at least for me, in university settings, so that the people who mentored me, one was Angelika Baumer, who is a scholar of comparative literature in German. And she was mentored by Evelyn Torten-Beck, who was a scholar of comparative literature and Yiddish, among other things. And we, we kind of found each other and because we needed each other, right? And that's kind of what I think feminist work brings to the possibilities of working across differences in ways that really allow for more space for difference. And I think that that's something that I really value. And I think that it is and I just really appreciate Halla talking about her work. And I thought about some of her teachers at Georgetown, and I can imagine who some of those people are. And I'm struck that literary theory and feminist theory and disability studies and race studies, critical race theory, dare I say, are critical to this work across difference as we continue to imagine a different future.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that. I want to sort of interject here that when we actually began planning for this panel, and we were looking at the sort of 32 contributors, we wanted to have Jewish, Christian, and Muslim voices. And then Laura, as you pointed out, scholars who are at different phases in their careers, sort of early, mid-career, and as well as established leaders in the field who, in the case of Susannah, was a signatory on top of Dabru Emet, Mary Boyes, who was very much in the mix when it was coming together. We ended up with an all-woman panel by sort of accident to a certain extent, and then went, yay us, let's go ahead and do this. And I'm just so delighted that you all agreed to join us today. And since we started talking about it, I kind of want to go a little bit further here and think about women in interreligious dialogue, women in leadership. And then sort of what do you think maybe has been lost in interreligious exchanges that don't include or elevate or prioritize women's voices, as well as others who are sort of marginalized in interreligious encounters, especially in sort of Abrahamic dialogues. And Halla, maybe we'll invite you to speak first on this.
Yes, thank you. So I'll begin by talking a little bit from my own positionality or perspective within the field. as a person of color who identifies as female and Muslim in Quranic studies. So Quranic studies is historically a field that is largely made up of white male non-Muslims. So arguably it's the positionality or the perspective that's really shaped important paradigms in the discipline that I'm working in. So it's something that I'm consistently very cognizant of. So this demographic is changing. You are beginning to see more women scholars in Quranic studies. You are beginning to see women of color a little bit, and more Muslim scholars, most of whom are men, to my knowledge. But women, I would say, remain to be the minority within this field. And so the question that I tried to touch upon too in my essay is not so much what happens, or it's not so much whether or not women are allowed to participate in this discourse, but what happens when minority voices present alternative perspectives, especially those that challenge this epistemological basis that's already been challenged, that's been established. So that's something that I'm very cognizant of and very interested in. And to follow up with what you were talking about, Laura, with regard to Tikva Frymer-Kensky, I was also very struck by David Novak's essay on the question of authority, and his discussion about the debate between he and Tikva Frymer-Kensky regarding the word authority. Again, as Laura said, Tikva Frymer-Kensky was the only female author. And her work was informed by feminist studies. And so she had disagreed with the use of this term because of its implications, because of its patriarchal and hierarchical implications. And reflecting back on this exchange, Novak writes that she ended up conceding far more than he did, and that ultimately she agreed to something that was not part of her principles. And I was actually quite struck and quite moved by this admission. I thought it was quite powerful. Obviously, we can't speak to precisely what happened or why Tikva Frymer-Kensky would have conceded there. But regardless, what's interesting to me is that to anybody who's a minority, women and especially women of color who are working in this intellectual setting, be it interfaith dialogue, Quranic studies, religious studies in general, there's something familiar about this account, right? It echoes this experience of having to adapt to the viewpoint of the majority just to be able to have a seat at the table, just to be able to participate. And it's just this awareness that as a woman, you have to adjust to those around you more than most will need to adjust to you, and particularly for folks like myself, I am a junior scholar. But turning to the question of what is lost, I think that there's a lot that is lost in interfaith learning because female voices are absent or are attenuated. One example that I've been really interested in is the concept of the Abrahamic traditions that you mentioned, this idea that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are joined based on this figure, Abraham and his family. So most of the discourse on the Abrahamic religions focuses on the male figures, Abraham and his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, while completely excluding the experiences of the women in these accounts, Sarah and her slave, Hagar. And there's just so much to be gained from these quote unquote female-centered stories that are integral to this idea of what is Abrahamic. And I think they're important because of the different levels of oppression that comes across in this story. The story of Sarah and Hagar gives a sobering account of the different power dynamics, not only with regard to gender, but also with regard to ethnicity and class. I mean, it's a story that makes most of us uncomfortable. Sarah has a slave. She gives her slave to Abraham for her to be impregnated. It's not a story that's aged very well. But with that said, I think this discomfort is important. It's an important part of the learning process. It's an important part of becoming more inclusive, more pluralistic, and this idea of reaching across the table to the so-called religious other, particularly given the fraught and painful histories, such as the ones between Judaism and Christianity. So with all that said, I mean, I definitely think, the inclusion and the deliberate inclusion of more female voices is not only important, but I think it's crucial for the broader project of interfaith learning.
May I jump in and say that I fully agree with you, Halla, and I actually would formulate it this way, that precisely at the time that the feminist critique of religion was beginning to develop and women were beginning to demand changes in their religious communities, that is the moment when religious dialogue took off. It took off because in some ways it was easier for Jews and Christians to sit down and talk to one another and try to come up with something nice to say about each other. It was easier to do that than to actually confront the feminist critique and what women were saying, which is so much more challenging, in fact, within the religious community, to challenge on the basis of what is, let's say, this passage doing in scripture? What is this ruling doing in the religious laws and so forth? So to what extent has interreligious dialogue actually functioned to suppress the voices of women and the feminist critique of religion, and perhaps other elements as well? On the other hand, I would also say that supersessionism, Christian supersessionism, began to be questioned in the middle of the 20th century, precisely at the time when European imperial powers were beginning to let go of their colonies. They were decolonizing. And if supersessionism is understood, as I have argued in some of my work, as a form of theological colonialism, then in fact, if Europe is decolonizing, then of course Christianity has to give up supersessionism. So we have to also consider the possibility that religious changes, theological changes, aren't taking place in a vacuum or in a sealed box in some way. They are part of broader political concerns to which they may respond positively in the case of supersessionism, or they may retreat and be very negative and push it away in the case of feminism. But I think the conjunction, and these are just two examples, is something that we ought to consider. We tend to think of interreligious dialogue in very positive terms, and I do too, by the way, but there are also some very problematic aspects to it. It can be used to fail to be used to refuse to consider other problems facing a religious community.
Thank you. Would anyone else want to weigh in?
I just want to say one brief thing is that when I was in college, I read Rosemary Ruther's Faith and Fratricide, which was a very powerful and important book for me as an undergraduate. And the fact that she went on to do feminist work was doing feminist work at the same time has always been kind of something that as Susannah was talking, I thought, oh yes, there's that. I always thought of them together. Although I agree with Susannah that in practice, that's not always the case, but I did want to just highlight this other figure because I think that's really important for us to remember.
Yes, of course, I would continue with Rosemary Ruther because she also went on to do a very serious critique of Zionism that actually put her, for many people, outside the framework of interreligious dialogue. So there's a longer arc to her career, which is a great career and fascinating, but it has some problematic questions for many people.
Absolutely. And this is another question about what's changed, to go back to the historical point where we began. After 2001, we have to deal with the ways in which Islamophobia has been so much a part of American culture and global culture. And it really, addressing questions of Islam and or Israel and Palestine were not a part of Dabru Emet and are still really fraught and difficult. And I think Susannah's absolutely right to point out that Ruther was really continuing to ask those questions. And I think that gives us a little clue to how how the possibility of feminist engagement does open up that kind of intersectional space of dealing with a range of differences together.
Well, just a quick point, because we had a great lecture recently at Dartmouth where I teach. Yulia Egorova from University of Durham talked about India and the way that, for example, Modi uses an alliance with Jews, philo-Semitism, an alliance with Israel to be Islamophobic, even worse than Islamophobic, to really alienate and persecute Muslims in India. So the other question is, to what extent do we allow our religious communities and traditions, our religion, to be used in this interfaith situation to exclude or to even persecute another religion? Is there a Christian-Jewish bond in some cases, and with some people, that forges itself on the grounds of Islamophobia? And to what extent, for example, and I actually can give you an example of this, a Muslim feminist is called in to speak to a Jewish group about what's wrong with Islam and its sexism, when we know that a Jewish feminist would not be called into the Jewish group to talk about problems of Judaism. So I think sometimes we're used in certain ways that are very problematic and unethical, in my opinion.
To jump in, if I can, that's a very important comment that you're making. And I do think that it depends on which Jews and which Christians. You know, we keep talking about Jewish-Christian dialogue as if it's this monolith, but there are all these different spaces. And I don't remember who mentioned it a few minutes ago, but I think it was you, Susannah, who was talking about how, in a way, it's easier for some Jews to speak to Christians than to Jews in other denominations. Ecumenical Jewish dialogue is very underdeveloped. That's a nice way of putting it. But I do think that, you know, there are communities of Jews engaged in various kinds of interfaith dialogue that will not talk to other communities of Jews engaged in other kinds of dialogue. I'll just name it because I'm sure we all know it. I'm talking about dialogue with evangelical Christians versus dialogue with Catholic Christians. And of course, there are all kinds of political motivations for this dialogue. And also, of course, on the Jewish side, there are different kinds of motivations and Jewish denominations that are entering into this dialogue. So I think it's actually an interesting question when we talk about Jewish-Christian dialogue, which dialogue are we talking about? I'm not in any kind, well, I'm maybe a little bit, but I'm really not situated in a Jewish evangelical space. So my experience has been very, very different. You know, both positively and with all the challenges that might bring. But I think it's an interesting question. You know, these dialogues are actually not in dialogue with each other, but maybe that will change.
Thank you for that. That's a great point. We're having this wonderful intersectional conversation, and I want to pick up some threads and keep us moving down this path. And to really bring in the issues of race and interreligious dialogue and issues of power as well. And to really think about the kind of milieu that brought about Dabru Emet, and really to just be very blunt about it, whether this was sort of primarily a dialogue and a document for white Jews and white Christians, sort of to interrogate the whiteness of it. And then how do we think about sort of Jews of color, Christians of color, Christians in the global South and Asia and Africa and elsewhere? Can sort of Dabru Emet or really interfaith spaces writ large address the sort of nuances of racial, and now we're talking about denominational and religious diversity? And maybe, I think, Laura, would you mind sort of starting us off here?
Yeah, and I'd also hope that Halla will chime in. I think Halla's point about the epistemic framework that sort of has constituted something called dialogue, right? Came out of a particular, and I would say, you know, a kind of bourgeois white sort of academic culture, right? And it had a certain kind of etiquette, et cetera. And so I think that if we were to have a conversation, if we were to bring together, and this is something I wrote a little bit about, basically building on, because I was really responding to all of your wonderful responses to Dabru Emet and all of the contributors' responses as the sort of last person kind of bringing these together. I just saw the real openings for different kinds of conversations, different kinds of critical engagements. And so, what would it look like for Jews of color to get together with Muslims of color and various Christians of color in this moment? So certainly Susannah's father was very much a part of a brilliant and powerful and compelling conversation. But what would it look like if we brought these folks together? If they got together again, I'm trying to find a way of talking about the language of not already constituting what the framework is. And so I'm not sure what it would look like. And I think that that's both exciting and interesting. So what are the kinds of connections and what are the kinds of differences and what kinds of questions emerge? And they might be really different questions based on the kind of where they're speaking from. Again, if we were doing in the American context, that's one thing, but if we're doing it in a global context, so if you're in Modi's India and you are a Muslim and you're talking to an Israeli Jew who is religious, so Orthodox maybe, what would that look like? Very different. It could be very, very different kind of conversation, and even what they would discuss might not look like something that we understand as, well, certainly it may not look like the language of Dabru Emet.
I would just point out that the World Council of Churches meeting I went to some years ago, it's clear, and I think everybody knows this, that for a lot of Christians in the global South, the question of Jews for Christians is irrelevant. They don't understand, they say it's a European issue. That's something that Christians themselves need to address. I would also note that in the New York Times today, the report on the Southern Baptist Convention meeting kept referring to, well, that's Pharisaic, that's Pharisaism, etc. So we have work to do. I certainly agree with you, Laura. Although I guess I would be, I would just add to that in addition to people of color having their meetings, which I wouldn't want to see that kind of division or segregation, but rather put questions and issues of race on the table for all of us. And I would say that from my own perspective, I find far greater resonance of my father's work in the writings of Black theologians and intellectuals than I do in the work of either white Jewish thinkers or Christian thinkers today. And that's something that I think has been neglected, because when people compare my father to Christians, it's always white Christians, and it drives me crazy.
If I may jump in.
Yeah, please.
I mean, the question of race and power is extremely important. And I found myself thinking about it more within the American context. And so in which case, whether the audience of Dabru Emet was imagined as white or not, I think Dabru Emet can address many nuances of race and power and the role that it plays within Christian-Jewish dialogue and beyond. But I think the question really is how. How can we think through the document to think through some of the contemporary issues that we're seeing? So one of the obvious tracks, I mean, could be sort of a revision or an expansion of the eighth claim that Jews and Christians must work together for peace and justice, but in a way that is more explicit about race, racism, and the intersectional nature of discrimination. As everybody has put so eloquently, I mean, discrimination is not simply one religious group against the other, but there are all these other identity markers that really come into play. But another less obvious trajectory here in reading Dabru Emet that I just sort of found myself thinking, if I may think out loud, is the reality that Christian Jewish understanding and dialogue basically emerged following the horrors of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust, as we all know, didn't just happen out of nowhere. It happened out following centuries of discrimination and negative and harmful representations of Jews in Christian writing and Christian thoughts. So bear with me. So to my mind, this is reminiscent of some of the patterns of discrimination followed by violence that we're seeing or becoming more and more aware of today. So much of the discourse that we're seeing, for example, such as those from Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Asian Lives Matter, the discourse of these groups have been there for decades, as Susannah is pointing out, through protests and so forth. But it seems that it is only when we see violence against minority bodies in an absurd and fantastical way that we begin to really note these perspectives from racial minorities and start to think more critically about the idea of representations. I mean, one obvious example is the killing of George Floyd, which would have remained hidden had it not been for the video that was recorded by witnesses. So there definitely seems to be this pattern, this cycle of violence followed by dialogue where marginal voices are suddenly included within at the mainstream level. So, you know, just thinking out loud, and all of which is to say that I think this reality behind Dabru Emet and Christian Jewish dialogue in general, that there's a lesson here that can be extended to other groups and other contexts, as Laura was saying, not only within these traditions, but also to other minority groups. And this includes racial minorities, but also other minorities, including gender minorities, and individuals with disability. Because ideally, we shouldn't have to wait for the violence before listening to alternative voices, especially when they do challenge elements within mainstream representations.
So I think one of the issues is that we tend to focus on one way of demonizing the other. And so Muslims are going to be concerned about Islamophobia and Jews about anti-Semitism, and that we don't talk about racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism as very closely related phenomena, each with their own particularities. So it's not a matter of avoiding the differences, but it's so that, because one of the things that I've noticed is that it's too easy to say, well, I'm preoccupied with this particular way of demonization, and I'm going to fight that, without realizing that we need this solidarity against all forms of demonization of the other. And now how we see in our country, with all the laws that are being passed against trans people. So they're kind of the new group. And I just had an email earlier today about how at Charlottesville, there was a lot of anti-LGBTQ language and memes and so forth. And that all of these, hate speech is related. And I think knowing the long history of anti-Semitism and seeing how that has so damaged the fabric of societies, it does help us to get a perspective on the consequences of racism and Islamophobia. And I still remember a moment in class not too long, maybe a couple of years ago, when a young Black woman said, I just never knew I should care about anti-Semitism too. And, you could repeat that across across various groups.
I want to kind of pick up, Mary, where you're pointing to and highlight a question from the audience. I'm just cognizant of time, so I'm going to try to start weaving questions from the audience into our conversation. And to sort of keep going with this LGBTQ aspect of our conversation. Susan Beck, who's a wonderful pastor here in Baltimore, in the LCA, the Lutheran tradition, puts in the chat that part of the debate within the LCA around issues of LGBTQ inclusion was the impact such that that decision would have on ecumenical and interfaith relationships. And so it even is an echo back to what Malka was saying before about who's talking to who and what happens when certain topics become taboo for certain types of dialogue. And so can you reflect a little bit more around Susan's questions, and Mary or others to go further about the sort of issues of LGBTQ inclusion and its role with interreligious movements and encounters?
Well, this is a case study in a sense of the problems of at least with the American Catholic Church, right? Whereas you have hostility on the part, well, generally speaking, very negative attitudes toward the LGBTQ community on the part of Catholic authorities. Within the actual practice of Catholic life, I find a great deal of openness. What is the source of the hostility? And I think a lot of it is not moving out of a particular kind of bubble and not understanding anything really about studies in sexuality. That's just one little take on this issue. At the same time, Catholic theologians have just come out with a rather powerful kind of analysis of the situation and has a number of other signatories. So in a sense, we have another example where theology has moved quite far, and we have the people who are the ecclesial authorities really simply repeating old teachings.
Thank you. Would anyone else want to weigh in? Thank you, Susan, for that question.
I would just say that really was the point of the way in which feminist issues, which are very much about sexuality and gender and sexual definition, and so on, just as the time that those issues were being raised within religious communities, this interfaith dialogue, so Jews could turn away from that and talk instead to Christians, who would make them feel good. And I guess part of this is, if we have to face up to the kind of gender and sexual problems of our communities, it's painful and it's difficult and it's challenging. And in some sense, it's much nicer to sit down as a Jew with Muslims, with Christians, and talk about all the nice things we like about each other's religions. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of interreligious dialogue? What is the purpose? Is it to make ourselves speak in nice ways about one another? Or is it in fact to disturb one another and say, you're not really living up to your principles? And on the question of authority too, that's part of the problem. When you get figures like bishops and rabbis and so forth speaking, they're constrained. There's a limit to what they will be able to say openly and freely. And since that's why it was better for Dabru Emet to have been written by scholars who could speak more freely, didn't have to answer to certain religious authorities.
I'm interested, Susannah, in your comment that sort of interfaith dialogue is kind of easier than confronting some of these seemingly more divisive issues. It's not my experience at all. Now that's simply my own experience, but it seems to me that particularly from a Christian point of view, that if you're really engaged in a religious dialogue, especially with Jews, it's extremely painful because one has to be vulnerable to the history and to discover this immense shadow side of one's tradition. I think, at least in the Catholic tradition, or even more generally in many Christian circles, it doesn't really take us off the painful discussions.
I understand. I do understand, and I do agree with you. And at the same time, I would say, and my impression is, it was easier for the Roman Catholic Church to give up let's say, the prayer for the perfidious Jews on Good Friday, or to give up hope for the eventual conversion of the Jews to Christianity, than it was for the Roman Catholic Church to accept the ordination of women.
Well, there's no question about that.
And that's what I mean by painful, by difficult, by challenge.
Right. Well, part of it is the structure in which the people who are making decisions have
And there is a painful history in Christian treatment of Jews.
Yes.
There's also a painful history that's not comparable, but a painful history about Christian treatment of women.
Right. Well, demographics are going to speak to this problem eventually here.
I hope so. But I wish instead it would be moral courage.
Yes, I wish that were the case.
I want to bring in two voices, one who are both contributors to the series. So Bob Cathy writes in the question, in the crisis of our times, is the age of great documents, the age of statements, is it over? Is this a time for interreligious partnerships and practical projects that address issues of justice, equity, global ecologic crisis, the pandemic, etc.? And I was thinking about framing Bob's question again. Bob, thank you for that, about Vicki Barnett, who is also here today and a contributor to the series. And so she, when she's sort of reflecting on the place of statements like Dabru Emet, she says the following, quote, perhaps the importance of interreligious statements should be measured not by their momentary mark, but whether they can create bridges between ever deepening processes of mutual commitment that began almost 75 years ago. And sort of the challenges, again, of interreligious relationships today. So what do we think about statements and the value of statements and the place of them, considering everything we've just been talking about?
I'd be glad to jump in. I'm very old-fashioned about this. I think statements are great. I know people roll their eyes and they say, many, we should get on the streets and we should engage in public service and we should have community action. That's all true. But that doesn't undermine a statement. That can work in partnership with the statement. So I think community partnership is wonderful, but I think statements are great. And the reason is because statements are not simply about policy or about trying to sort of wield influence and change a governing body or a powerful body. I think statements help people, help a community, a faith community, understand who it is, shape its sort of its mission, its values, as long as, and this is very important, it's open to being signed by all members of the community. And what we have seen in the past is that not all of these statements are open to the public, and that's the problem. So if you have a statement that is sort of crowdsourced and that this is very hard to do, but if you can invite the community to be a part of the process of writing it, and then you can say not just to others, this is who we are, but to the community itself, this is who we are and we're proud of it and we own it and we want to share that self-understanding with others, then it can be very powerful. But again, it has to be open to everyone from the beginning of that writing process and then through the signing process. And I'll say on a personal level, there was a statement, it wasn't Dabru Emet, that I asked to sign and I was told, well, it's just for clergy. So most Orthodox Jews, although this is changing, are not in communities that ordain women. And so by saying, well, this is just for clergy, then you're shutting out a member of the Jewish community, not just one member, but many, many. By the way, a year later or so, my name was added without being informed. I just saw online a list of signatories for this particular document, and there I was. My name was on the statement. So I don't know if that's good or troubling. But the point is that I think statements could be very useful, again, not in terms of how they might change policy, but in terms of how they shape the self-understanding of those who are speaking. And it can be also a way of bringing people in to that process of shaping that self-understanding if it's inclusive.
I have a similar take to you in that I very much believe in the power and the potential of statements. I'm not sure about having a big crowd writing a statement. I bet gives my editor's brain a kind of an overwhelming wave. But I think actually good statements come from groups that can have conversations in which they can articulate common understandings, and that statements, I think they have a pedagogical value. They become resources for a community. I mean, here we are talking about Dabru Emet 20 some years later. It doesn't have to be, it isn't that the statement has to be even adequate. I think we should aim for the very best articulation, but it's to get something out in the public that has a potential to last. I was part of the writing of a document called The Sacred Obligation that our Christian Scholars Group produced 2 years after Dabru Emet. And one of the things that I want to say about the process of writing that statement is that for scholars to have to work in collaboration and to find terms that are publicly accessible and not, I mean, I love footnotes when I write, but the world is not interested in all of the clarifications and so forth that we like to put in our footnotes. So how can we say complex things in a compelling and accessible manner? And I think that's the great challenge of writing a statement. And then the question, of course, pedagogically is what do we do with it later? I mean, how do we use it to move ahead, to move the thinking ahead?
And if I could just add, I do agree, Mary, that the idea of a crowdsourced statement is basically a logistical impossibility, but I don't think that it should be limited ideally to just an elite few. At the very least, the option for members of the community to sign the statement should be sort of a baseline.
And if I could add as well, I completely agree with you both. I love written documents. It's probably because I'm an academic. I work with text. That's what I do. But I mean, I agree with you both. But I like the tangible material nature of statements. I like being able to go back to written words. I mean, and there's a discursive nature to any statement. And I think that was evident by all the wonderful contributions in the series. And then I think it's that discursiveness too that I think can help pave the way for kind of more creativity and more thoughts and more questions moving forward. So there is something nice about having something tangible in your hands that's just delineated, spelled out. I agree.
I would just add one thing, and that is that the writers of Dabru Emet followed up with a solid volume of scholarship. With this is a this is an anthology that has Christian respondents, but this is a very worthwhile book for those of you who like footnotes. Christianity in Jewish terms.
Thank you so much for that, highlighting that volume. It's a really important one, both for the sort of inheritance of Dabru Emet, but also for ICJS, because we had a lot of contributing voices in that volume. I want to weave in another audience question, just being cognizant of the time. A person is citing, and again, things are coming in, both the questions and answers and the chat. So folks are helping me parse these. Talking about Dabru Emet claim 1, specifically that Jews and Christians worship the same God. And a person in the audience wants to know, if we're to think about that further, what is that saying about offering common worship sporadically? And what happens with interfaith prayer? Would anyone want to talk about that based off of claim 1? But I think it's an interreligious challenge and an interreligious topic worthy of discussion.
Well, I would just say one interesting ethnographic study that I would recommend is Samira Mehta's book, Chrismica, which is on interfaith families and a kind of history of Jewish Christian interfaith in the United States. And she also is attentive to questions of gender and power, as well as race and ethnicity. And in some of the ethnographic later chapters, there are communities who are worshiping together. And I think that there are a range of folks who feel more or less comfortable with that. And I think even the respondents to Dabru Emet in this series differ on this question about how they feel about question 1. And I think that there are respectful and powerful claims to be made about the same and different gods or whatever in relation to that question. And I think there's still possibilities of conversation whether or not those are the same, but I would recommend Meta's book.
Thank you for that. Oh, Halla, please.
So I'm thinking about this with regard to Islam, because, you know, this question of whether the monotheistic traditions worship the same God or not. And I think it's a difficult one. So on an academic level, on a textual level, I want to say nobody does. There are different representations of God in different texts. But with regard to the treatment of Muslims in public discourse, this idea that Muslims worship a different God is regularly used as a way to otherize. So I think it's a really tough one, because there's, it's an important similarity within monotheistic discussions, but at the same time, you don't want to iron out the important differences.
I think there's also an assumption that all Jews understand God in the same way. And that's never been true historically. So those who are in a Kabbalistic tradition, a Hasidic tradition, have a very different understanding than the understanding that I think, how shall I say, that I find in the Orthodox synagogue that I go to, for example, which is very, what shall I say, Germanic in its approach, philosophical, rational, etc. And that, of course, comes to the larger problem. What does it mean to speak of Judaism in the singular? Is there such a thing? As Daniel Boyarin and others, Neusner, etc., have argued, to try to do interfaith dialogue sometimes can be limiting because one wants to speak of Judaism here as a thing, or the tradition as if it's in a little box, and it isn't. All of our religious traditions are breathing and living and changing from moment to moment and are multiple. And that's why interreligious dialogue within the Jewish community, within the Muslim community, within the Christian, and so on, that's also important. Once again, I just want to say one of the things about statements, and I think statements are very helpful to many people. They tend to also involve a certain kind of negotiation that can be very helpful. And Dabru Emet is an example of it. Those four people were negotiating with each other, and I'm sure it was a thrilling experience for them. On the other hand, when I think about progress, as we might say, or when I think about moments when something dramatic has happened, it can come in a very different way. I think about W.D. Davies, the New Testament scholar, who came from a village in Wales and went to Cambridge University, I think it was, and met David Daube, who was a Jew from Germany, a refugee from Hitler. And that transformed the way W.D. Davies understood Paul and the Pauline epistles as a form of rabbinic theology, not as something Christian. And those kinds of relationships can be extraordinary and change the course of a field. So the statements have their place, but there are other things, other experiences that I wish we would all embrace, in fact, because we're all open to that possibility if we would extend ourselves in that way. Malka, you work at a Catholic institution, for example, or Halla, your work on Quran and Hebrew Bible. Or I think of Angelika Neuwirth, the great Quran scholar from Germany who went to live in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the old city, where she heard people praying, and she became attuned to the sounds of prayer of Christians, Jews, Muslims, and how that affected her understanding of the poetic rhythm of the Quran. So these exposures that we have as individuals can really have incredible results for us and for the whole field.
Well, and this is what we do in the classroom. And this goes back to this question about, the importance of, I would just want to say religious studies broadly construed. and the powerful interactions that happen in university settings, like so many of Susannah's stories. You know, a teacher, a student, we learn from our students and they learn from us. And we work across a lot of differences. And these are really productive sites where I think some of the most powerful kinds of interreligious engagement happen. And I think they still happen, and they happen in powerful ways. So my student who is a Buddhist nun who is trying to understand how rabbinic thought works in a Judaism seminar was just really extraordinary. And she just kept asking because she came from such a different place. And that's the sort of power and beauty of, I think, you know, what we do in colleges and universities. And I just want to kind of put out that plea for religious studies and for the humanities broadly construed. We've talked about how literature and critical theory and critical race studies, and these are all really important parts of the ways in which we open up horizons of meaning and make possibilities for people to engage people who they never thought they would talk to. And we love that.
And my guess is, Laura, that having a student in your class who's Buddhist studying Judaism also changed the way you feel about.
Absolutely.
Right. So these encounters are good for us too. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, we learn from our students. We learn from our colleagues. This is why we go to conferences. I mean, this is why we have forums like this. It's to open up those spaces. And, you know, I'm just very moved by Malka's work in this Catholic context and the power of that kind of critical engagement, which is really a very specific site, and attention to the specificity of that site is just so important. And I just so appreciated your talking about that and talking about your predecessors who were there, because that's a kind of legacy of this interreligious possibility, right?
Thank you. That's very gracious of you. And I mean, if you know Father John and Rabbi David Samuel, you would know that I'm not filling their shoes because they cannot be filled. I'm just sort of continuing their work in a small way. On a less transcendent note, because your words are so beautiful, I almost feel bad following up. But I do want to go back to the question of the same God issue, because as Susannah was speaking, I was thinking over and over of the phrase Judeo-Christian, which is such a red flag. And it's so problematic, whether it's Judeo-Christian God or Judeo-Christian religion or values. This is a very, very problematic phrase. Most of the time I don't even know if this is true. My sense is that it's often used by Christians, often supersessionistically. It's problematic. And I think that this does touch on the question of whether there are some legitimate reasons for Jews to be protective of their boundaries. And this question of who gets to define your faith community. In my personal experience, who gets to define Jews and Judaism and the boundaries that they have made over the past 2,000 years, but in other faith community too, who gets to talk about Christianity and describe it. And I will just say, we haven't talked so much about the Shoah, but when I do speak to my Catholic students about the Holocaust, very often it's useful for me to bring in a colleague, because when we hear certain things from members of our faith community, we hear it differently. And, you know, I do think that there are things that are most useful within the context of intra-Jewish conversation, and other things that are great for interreligious dialogue, and other things that are important for intra-Christian. But the question is, who should be having these conversations? Who should be creating these definitions? And boundaries that can threaten our sense of safety. I don't know if they should be respected or questioned, but I can say from the Jewish perspective, it can sometimes feel that being defined or being described by an outside community can feel very, very threatening. And whether that is legitimate or not, you know, this is for another 90-minute panel, not for one that has come to its conclusion.
So just a very brief perspective on this, and that is, I imagine you're the only Jew full-time on the faculty of Catholic Theological Union.
Yes.
And I think that when you are the only one, you have to be at home with being a stranger. And I'm the only full-time Catholic faculty member at Union Theological Seminary. And I've heard many crazy things about Catholicism since I've been there. And, you know, there's a few microaggressions and it's all right. You know, Halla and I grew up in Seattle, the very secular city of Seattle. And so I was never part of a Catholic dominant culture. So, but I do think that's part of the cost we pay personally to be, you know, one of the few or the other in the institution. I suspect I see you nodding, Susannah. I'm sure Dartmouth has its own challenges for you, and you know, so I think we need to embrace that, and because it helps us to understand what it means. When we feel othered, it's important to pay attention to what that feels like, because then we have a sense that we can really feel what the other might, for the extension of compassion.
I absolutely agree with that.
That is a wonderful sentiment and an idea to sort of close with. I just want to express my gratitude to all of the panelists here today for an incredibly rich conversation. I also just want to also acknowledge the conversation that's been happening in the chat, which has also been rich and amazing. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to bring more of your thinking and questions into our discussion today. And I just, before I sort of give a final word to each participant, stressing on the point of word, just a few words, just recognizing the time. I want to invite everyone in the audience today to give us feedback on the program. If you could sort of do a brief evaluation, you can just open it in your browser window right now and then complete it while the experience is still fresh. We would greatly appreciate it. I also want to make a plug that ICJS is an independent, non-sectarian nonprofit unaffiliated with any academic or religious organization, which allows us a certain amount of freedom to curate these types of programs and conversations. And we are supported by people like you. And we're striving to make all of our programming available at no cost. And so if you were able to make a donation to help make this work possible, we would greatly appreciate it. And so then finally, I just want to go back to this amazing group who we are here today and ask you each in sort of 30 seconds to 1 minute, sort of what comes next? Where do you see, what are you excited about for interreligious thinking and partnership going forward? And I'll do the reverse alphabet. And so invite Malka to go first.
I wasn't prepared. I'm excited for, and this goes back to what all of the panelists have said, but especially Susannah, increased diversity in interreligious spaces.
Oh, fantastic. Laura.
Yeah, well, I would say that too, but I think the other thing that I want to say is I really like the idea of a kind of radical openness that one of the contributors talked about, and Maira, I think, was the person I was thinking of. So I want to think about, and the risks of that kind of openness, because I think this is risky business and we need to be more vulnerable to have those conversations that Malka was talking about. Thank
you, Susannah.
Well, I agree with what Laura and Malka said, of course. I guess one of the things that I look for and have sometimes received is a kind of profound inspiration for me as a Jew in my religiosity when I am with people from different religions, traditions, when I am with Muslims and when I am with Christians. There are times when I come away feeling deeper, more deeply engaged in Judaism in a religious sense, in a spiritual sense. And so that's what I hope for from these experiences, and I wish for other people as well.
Thank you. Mary.
I would say exactly what Susannah just did, maybe, but just this morning, I happened to be on a Zoom call with a rabbi in Jerusalem, whom I haven't known in the past. We're getting ready for a presentation. And it just moved me so deeply. We were talking about the Psalms and just her knowledge of the Midrash. So there's so much to learn from one another. And I just think that's the great gift of our time. even over Zoom. And I have to say, I can't wait till we can all be together in one room, touching each other.
Yes. I'll give you a big hug, I promise. So,
Okay.
and Halla.
Yeah, I would repeat everything that everybody had just said. Increase diversity, more questioning, more self-reflection, more engagement, and deep sensitivity to our conversation partners.
Well, thank you all for an amazing 90-minute conversation. I feel like I learned so much, and I'm just grateful to you all. And thank you all for joining us today. And I hope to see you again in person sometime soon, but if not, on Zoom again as well. So thank you so much and have a wonderful night.